Today's mindful moment. Okay, consider this. What we think we know about the past. It isn't just a neat pile of facts, is it? It's more like uh, a battleground of memory. What gets remembered, what gets forgotten, really shapes how we see things now.
Exactly. And that's absolutely vital when we look at the tangled history between Central America and the United States.
Right. So today we're digging into that relationship, drawing on the material you provided to understand where today's narratives and realities really come from.
hmm And the goal isn't just to list facts, it's to connect the dots, to find those surprising links that explain why things are the way they are. We want you to come away with a clearer picture, feeling informed but not overwhelmed.
Okay, so let's start with colonialism. The sources you shared mentioned this really interesting contrast around something called the Black Legend. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. So historically, the way Spanish and British colonialism were talked about was, well, very different. The Black Legend, mostly pushed by English speakers,
Hmm.
painted the Spanish as these uniquely brutal, backward conquistadors,
Hmm.
all about violence and plunder.
Yeah.
But the key thing here isn't just whether it was totally accurate. It was a powerful story, a tool, really. It helped build this narrative of European superiority, specifically British superiority.
Mm.
And that had huge long-term effects on how the world saw Latin America versus the U.S.
So the Spanish get cast as the bad guys.
Right.
What about the British story about themselves?
Well, their narrative was all about hardworking colonists, and that word choice is deliberate, right?
Yeah.
Building farms on supposedly empty land, diligent, self-sufficient.
Hmm.
And this story served a very clear purpose. It made the later differences in wealth and power between the U.S. and Latin America seem natural, almost inevitable. The idea was that English speakers, maybe Northern Europeans generally, were just more advanced, morally better, and so they deserved to be on top.
But that sounds, well, pretty one-sided based on the sources.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to see it as a legend, right? Crafted to hide some awkward truths. British colonizers were just as focused as the Spanish on converting indigenous people and, critically, on getting rich off the colonies.
Right.
Maybe the Spanish hit the jackpot first with gold and silver, but the British quickly set up their own brutal plantation systems, especially in the Caribbean. So the basic goals, pretty similar, actually.
That really reframes things. Now, something else that struck me was this idea of the conquistador myth. We tend to picture figures like Cortez or Pedro de Alvarado single-handedly leading these conquests, but it's more complicated.
It really is. Traditional history loves those larger-than-life figures, but newer research really pushes back on that. A key insight is that places like Mexico and Central America were already home to complex, competing indigenous empires before the Spanish ever showed up.
So these weren't just like a few Spaniards against huge numbers of natives.
Not at all. Those famous Spanish victories, they were largely won by rival indigenous groups. These groups had their own histories, their own conflicts, and they saw the Spanish as maybe useful allies, a tool to get ahead of their old enemies.
Huh.
So while the Spanish probably thought they were using native allies, indigenous groups were absolutely using the Spanish for their own strategic reasons. It totally challenges that old Eurocentric story of just Spanish dominance.
Wow, that puts indigenous agency front and center in a way you don't often hear.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the indigenous people who weren't part of those big empires? How did things play out for them, especially in Central America?
Well, indigenous resistance and just sheer survival were actually pretty strong in large parts of Central America. These areas were more rural, didn't have the obvious gold or silver, so they just weren't as economically attractive to the Spanish compared to, say, Mexico or Peru.
So the Spanish didn't focus their main efforts there.
Less so. Their big bureaucratic and military machine was concentrated where the money was. This meant colonial interaction took different forms in places like Guatemala and El Salvador.
Like what?
Well, you get what some call Catholic colonialism. Missionaries, Franciscans, and Dominicans were sent out to gather dispersed indigenous populations into settlements called reducciones. Easier to control, easier to convert.
But did it work perfectly?
Not really. People resisted. In the Guatemalan highlands, the Spanish were constantly trying to round up people who'd fled back to the hills. And even in the mission towns, people often ignored or reinterpreted the religious teachings. Priests often didn't even speak the local language as well.
Makes sense.
And you have to remember regional differences, too. The Caribbean coast of Central America, much less Spanish Catholic influence, more ties to the British Protestant missionaries, and later, importantly, U.S. banana companies. Very different history there.
Interesting. Okay, let's zoom in on the Spanish colonial system itself. What were its main features?
It was pretty rigid. Think tightly controlled trade, church and state working hand in glove, and a strict social hierarchy. Top dogs were the peninsulares born in Spain. They got the best government and economic jobs.
Hmm?
Then came the Creoles people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. And at the bottom, officially, were the indigenous people. Now, in the rich centers like Mexico, indigenous people faced really harsh labor demands, tribute.
But not everywhere.
Right. In less central areas, like much of Central America, the Spanish had the system of two republics, the Republic of Indians and the Republic of Spaniards. In theory, it gave indigenous communities some protection, some autonomy, their own local leaders and rules.
Huh. Two republics?
Yeah, though it was never perfectly separate. Over time, you had growing numbers of mixed-race people, mestizos, indigenous people moving into the Spanish world, and also enslaved and free black populations. So that neat division got pretty blurry.
So given all this complexity, indigenous agency, the different colonial experiences, why do we tend to forget or downplay these parts of the story?
Well, there are pretty self-interested reasons, aren't there? Conquerors, elites, the people who end up on top, they usually want to promote a version of history that makes their power look legitimate, maybe even inevitable. It erases the messy, violent parts of how they got there.
And they control how the story gets told.
Often, yes. They control schools, government records, the media. That's how the official narrative gets spread. Now, that doesn't mean other memories don't exist. Counter-memories often survive in oral traditions, in community life.
But they can be suppressed.
Definitely. People might forget or choose not to remember out of shame, fear, or just self-preservation. Remembering can be painful, even dangerous, especially if the same groups who caused the harm are still in power, which, has often been the case in Central America.
It actually reminds me of something you mentioned, the importance of analyzing the narratives we consume, like the work done by Mindful Moments and our podcasts, the AI audiobook analysis channel. It's about dissecting those stories.
Exactly. Understanding who is telling the story and why is crucial.
The sources also had this striking little story and anecdote about a plantation owner and a rooster. What's the point there?
Yes. It's a really telling image of how people who benefit from unfair systems can just evade responsibility. The owner hits the rooster with his car, right? But blames the rooster for being in the way. It's a way of shifting blame, making themselves seem innocent, washing their hands a bit.
A kind of willful blindness?
Precisely. And that ties into the poems you mentioned by Otto Rene Castillo and Carolyn Forche.
Right, how do they connect?
Both poets are confronting the violence embedded in systems of inequality, how elites often make the suffering of the poor invisible. But they're also talking to us, to U.S. audiences. There's a subtle challenge there, suggesting maybe we're also involved, that our own ignorance might be a kind of convenient forgetting.
Forche's poem, The Colonel, seemed particularly direct about that.
It is. It's incredibly powerful. She recounts this horrific encounter with the Salvadoran colonel, the casual brutality. But the poem starts, "What you have heard is true." She's addressing an American reader, implying we already know about these things, but maybe we've chosen to look away.
And the ending.
The colonel dismissing human rights concerns. It feels like an accusation aimed at American complacency, at a kind of privileged forgetting that lets us judge others without examining our own role.
Which leads directly to this idea of the U.S. itself forgetting Central America, or at least its own history there.
Yes, it's a real pattern. Researchers looking into the U.S. role often hit roadblocks. Classified documents, missing records, just a general institutional silence.
Like that story about the U.S. Embassy officials in El Salvador.
Exactly. In 1985, researchers ask about past human rights abuses, maybe U.S. involvement, and the officials basically say, oh, that's the past. Let's focus on a new beginning. It's a way of wiping the slate clean, right? But it completely ignores how that past created the present. You can't just declare a new beginning without dealing with the foundations.
So independence wasn't a clean break either for the U.S. or Central America. The colonial past lingered.
Absolutely. Independence brought new flags, new governments, yes. But those colonial structures and attitudes, deeply embedded. In the U.S., independence actually fueled expansion, what some historians call settler colonialism. The goal wasn't just getting resources, but replacing the original population. And Central America was increasingly in its sights.
And in Central America.
Colonial racial hierarchies largely stayed in place, just maybe tweaked a bit. And you get new forms of U.S. influence layered on top: economic dominance, political interference. That idea of the U.S.'s first way of war, total war against civilians, based on racial superiority, that really set a pattern for how the U.S. interacted with the region later.
Okay, so after independence, this new liberal order emerges in Central America. What was that about?
Well, the new elites, the liberals, wanted to modernize. Their model was export economies, coffee, bananas, that sort of thing, progress. But this vision of progress usually meant bad news for indigenous people.
How so?
New national armies and police forces were created, and a big part of their job was pushing indigenous communities off desirable land, forcing people into labor on the new plantations. Guatemala is a stark example. Liberal reforms actively dismantled colonial protections for indigenous land, benefiting coffee growers and the military.
Was it the same everywhere?
Not exactly. In El Salvador, initially, some smaller farmers actually benefited from the coffee boom. But eventually, most lost their land too, becoming wage laborers, basically proletarianized. Still, even with land loss, indigenous communities in El Salvador showed real resilience, maintaining their identities through things like religious brotherhoods, the cofradías.
It sounds like U.S. policymakers and these Central American elites saw eye to eye on a lot of this.
They really did. Both largely saw indigenous populations as, well, obstacles to progress. The shared belief was that U.S. investment in export economies were the path forward.
The sources mentioned William Walker, the American who invaded Nicaragua.
Right, in the 1850s. He briefly took over. It's a bizarre episode, but it had this weird effect. Even though he was eventually kicked out, his invasion somehow strengthened the Nicaraguan elite's admiration for the U.S. model of progress and modernity.
Even though he was an invader.
Paradoxical, isn't it? But it also revealed a harsher side of U.S. expansionism, manifest destiny. Later, the U.S. actually occupied Nicaragua for a long time, from 1912 to 1933. And again, you see this tension, fostering desire for U.S.-style progress, but also causing a resentment among local elites who bristled at American arrogance. They were constantly trying to balance wanting U.S. help with hating U.S. dominance.
So bringing it all together, what are the long-term consequences of all this forgetting, this erasure of history?
It's profound. That suppression of indigenous identity and communal life throughout the 20th century, driven by those ideas of progress, it fed directly into a culture of repression. And that culture exploded into the brutal civil wars of the late 20th century.
And there's a link to the U.S. too.
You can draw a disturbing parallel. The U.S.'s own history as a settler colonial nation, its treatment of its own indigenous peoples. That mindset arguably contributed to the militarization of Central America, and now the militarization of the U.S. southern border against people fleeing the consequences of that history. These things are deeply connected, even if we try to forget.
Wow. So, to wrap up, the stories we tell ourselves about history are never neutral. They're constructed, they serve interests, and the choices about what to remember and what to forget have had huge ongoing consequences for the relationship between the U.S. and Central America, shaping the world we see today.
Exactly. Forgetting isn't passive, it has real effects.
On that note, maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about the main stories, the dominant narratives in your own life or society. How might they be shaping your view? What might they be hiding?
It's so important to keep asking those questions, to look for the silences, the perspectives that are usually left out.
Absolutely. To keep exploring, please subscribe, share this discussion if you found it valuable, and you can find a link to purchase the source material if you want to dive even deeper. But most importantly, keep thinking critically about the histories we're given and the ones that get pushed aside.